All right, and we are recording. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Good evening and welcome to tonight's installment of Roger Williams University's lecture series, Hidden Truths, Stories of Race and Place, now in its third year. This lecture series is sponsored by the Provost Office and presented by the RWU Public Humanities and Arts Collaborative, or the CoLab. I'm Elaine Stiles, Assistant Professor of Historic Preservation and the Faculty Director of the CoLab. So the goal of the Hidden Truths series is to engage the campus community and the public in deeper understandings and informed dialogues around racial justice and equity issues embedded in local and global histories. And tonight we will be looking at global histories with our presenter, Dr. Anjali Ram, who is Professor of Communications and Media Studies in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Education. And Dr. Ram has a PhD and an MA in Communication Studies from Ohio University and an MA and BA in English from the University of Pune, India. Her teaching and scholarship are grounded in the critical cultural studies tradition and centers ethics of inclusion, equity, and social justice. Dr. Ram's research explores the role of media in constructing collective cultural meanings of home, gender, belonging, and identity. Additionally, she writes about how narratives of body politics, culture, and race are shifting with regard to the recent visibility of South Asian bodies in mainstream American media. In addition to her book, Consuming Bollywood, Gender, Globalization, and Media in the Indian Diaspora, Dr. Ram's work on these topics also appears in several scholarly journals and edited books. Dr. Ram is also actively engaged in conversations related to inclusive pedagogy on campus in her role as co-facilitator of the Diversity and Inclusion Faculty Fellowship, and was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award in 2021. Her presentation today is titled Outsider at Home, the Anti-Colonial, Anti-Casteist Vision of Babasaheb Ambedkar. This work is based on a forthcoming co-authored article in a special issue of the Journal of Personality on psychobiographies of social change agents. Thank you, Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Elaine, for that introduction, and to the CoLab and to the Hidden Truths series for this opportunity to present today my talk, Outside at Home, the Anti-Colonial and Anti-Caste Vision of Babasaheb Ambedkar. So most of you who are looking at these images can probably recognize this person. This is Mahatma Gandhi, who led the movement to overthrow British colonialism in India and who promoted ideas of non-violence as a liberatory political strategy. He's considered a global inspirational figure. However, many of you might not recognize this person, who is the subject of my talk today. This is Babasaheb Ambedkar, who was also one of the leaders of the anti-colonial movement to overthrow the British occupation of India. And many would argue that he is even more significant than Gandhi, as he was the architect of the Indian Constitution and has left a rich and progressive legacy of social justice. In 2012, he was voted as the greatest Indian ever in a poll conducted in partnership with CNN, various other media outlets, and the History Channel. While Babasaheb Ambedkar stands out as the greatest of all time in a sea of over 1.3 billion people, he's relatively unknown in the Western world and Western academia. In contrast, Mahatma Gandhi is a figure that is globally familiar. Gandhi stands as a symbol of all things Indian in the global imagination. The image and words of Gandhi can be found on gift shop, coffee mugs, posters, t-shirts, and pens. You can find these all on Amazon. But the global domination of the sort of Gandhi imagery functions to oversimplify India's anti-colonial struggles and to obscure some of the powerful caste interests that were embedded in it. As the writer Arundhati Roy said, Gandhi is the saint of the status quo. In the 1980s, the director Richard Attenborough made an Oscar-winning and much feted biographical film called Gandhi. And Roy observes that Dr. Ambedkar, as he is known, did not even have a walk-on part, despite being Gandhi's most formidable opponent. So in this presentation, I want to introduce the Roger Williams University community to an important voice on social justice who has left a visionary and political and social legacy for both India and the world, expand the Western narrative of India's anti-colonial movements beyond the oversimplified figure of Gandhi. And I wanted to cover four topics. One is, what is caste? Who was Ambedkar? What do we learn about caste oppression from his work? And then just to bring it back to the present day here in the United States, are there any caste questions we need to consider in the United States right now, right here? Now, I'm going to first sort of talk a little bit about caste. So in India, caste has historically been a significant force that has categorized Hindu society into groups. While the origin of the caste system remains in obscurity, scholars agree that it is at least, 2,000 years old and evolved from what's known as the Varna system. Hinduism, broadly understood, has been and continues to be the dominant religion in India, and the caste system has historically derived its legitimacy by resting on Hindu origin myths and religious ideas related to purity and pollution. Caste is therefore a socio-religious construct and is assigned by birth. A child would inherit their ancestors' caste, and this inherited caste would assign you on a scale of status and purity. To better understand caste, we need to look at two concepts, the Varnas and the Jatis. The Varnas refer to the four broad class stratifications that relate to occupation. So you have this image here on your screen to help you understand that. The Brahmins, or the priest class, were assigned the highest rank. The Kshatriyas was the next rank, were warriors and kings. The Vaishyas were the merchants and tradespeople. And the Shudras were seen as the peasants and farmers and artisans. They were placed in the lowest category. Now, outside the four Varnas were those members of Indian society that were considered as outcasts, as out of this caste system, or Avarnas. And it is these members of society that were identified historically as untouchable and unseeable. The author Anand Telathambre explains, any contact with members of this group, even their sight, sometimes even their shadow, was held to be ritually polluting and abhorrent, and then elaborate purifications would have to be undertaken if such occurred. Now, these so-called outcasts were given tasks all related to decay and death and anything that was considered unclean. So removal of waste from the villages or various spaces, flaying of animal carcasses, tending to funeral pyres and funeral areas. Now, the Avarnas also included the indigenous groups in India, who are referred to as Adivasis in India, and are considered by many accounts as being the original people in South Asia. Now, the Shudras, the blue bar, the lowest category in the Varna system, along with the Avarna categories of Adivasis and Dalits, are considered as historically caste-oppressed groups. And caste oppression means that these groups were historically subject to brutal violence, exploited, and left with very little access to power. Now, this four-part Varna system was in practice subdivided into thousands of jatis, which evolved over a millennia. And with very many regional variations. Think of them as clans or communities based primarily on occupational role. To quote Ambedkar, caste is the monster that crosses your path. You cannot have political reform, you cannot have economic reform unless you kill this monster. India achieved independence from the British in 1947, and the constitution of the modern Indian state, thanks to the Herculean task of Ambedkar, made caste discrimination illegal and has progressive laws aimed to empower these groups who were historically caste oppressed through very extensive affirmative action style policies. So on a broad national level, reform has happened and progress has been made. However, caste-based discrimination, oppression, and violence continues to occur in various ways, especially in inter-group interactions. Now, while we consider the history of casteism in India, an important question that sometimes gets raised is, what was the role, if any, of British imperialism, colonialism in the caste system? So colonialism certainly did not create the caste divisions, but it definitely complicated it. British colonial administration inked what might at times have been dotted lines that divided various Jati groups. And this resulted in intensifying and formalizing sometimes informal caste divisions. British colonial rule, as always, worked towards very self-serving purposes, finding opportunities to promote one group over the other, exploit existing divisions to rule, extract labor, and so on. And so there were instances where the British exacerbated the divisions of caste by taking informal and sometimes fluid Jati categories and fixing them in a formal administrative system. Additionally, there are notorious colonial discourses that sort of bought into and amplified the case of Brahmin superiority. At the same time, ironically, there were also instances where by formalizing some of these caste categories and looking for better ways to administer Indian society, some members of caste oppressed groups were able to temporarily sometimes achieve some access to educational resources and social mobility. So as I said, coloniality complicated caste in India. Now, before we get into who Babasaheb Ambedkar was and his contributions, I want to talk about some terms. So understanding caste as a social phenomena means understanding some of how these terms have evolved from stigmatization to empowerment. The term untouchable refers to caste-oppressed groups, as I talked about in the last slide, that were considered polluting and was used commonly until it was legally abolished in modern India, in large part to Ambedkar's efforts. It's an abhorrent term on every level. And in this presentation, I only use it when I'm providing historical context or if I'm using a direct quote to make a point. Around the early 1900s, when a lot of debates around casteism was taking place, the term that was used was depressed classes. And if you read Ambedkar's work, that's what he uses as well. And this was pointing to the oppression experienced by some caste groups. Again, it's not a term we use today in India. Now, Mahatma Gandhi did definitely oppose the oppressive and violent practices that discriminated against caste groups and offered another term that was Harijan. Now, and what this means is God's children. Now, while it was popular for a while, and sometimes it's still used, it's very criticized, rightfully so, for being a very patronizing, condescending term that frames caste-oppressed groups as children who need to be saved by a liberal, benign, upper caste savior. And moreover, what's important, which people are not aware of very often, is that Gandhi did not oppose the caste system itself. He just believed that we needed to get rid of the biased and hateful attitudes that people held towards one another based on caste, but thought the caste system itself gave stability to Indian society. And that was the main sort of wedge between Ambedkar and Gandhi. Today, the preferred term that we use is Dalit. And while at times it means downgraded other or oppressed, it has also been reclaimed by Dalit communities to represent hope, emancipation, and resistance to human suffering. It's a term that's used by activists and scholars and people who identify as part of the Dalit community. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a basic understanding of the history of caste as an oppressive group. And I want to now turn to the central figure of my talk, Babasaheb Ambedkar. Ambedkar was born in 1891 in the Mahar community. And that meant he was part of a Jati that was considered untouchable at the time. He has been referred to by various people, authors, particularly by Roy, as the doctor and the saint. Through both his own perseverance and talent and supporters and allies, he was able to defy some of the limitations placed on him due to his caste positionality. As Dr. Ambedkar, he was a professor and a lawyer with doctorates from Columbia University, London School of Economics. He established multiple newspapers, formed social and political organizations, established Educational institutions formed trade union groups, the list goes on. As Babasaheb Ambedkar, he is the venerated and beloved leader who forcefully championed for caste justice and equity while also fighting to end British colonial rule in India. He is remembered today in India primarily for being the first law minister and the chief architect of the modern Indian constitution. Because of his efforts, the Indian constitution has established very explicit affirmative action policies with regard to caste oppressed groups and gender, which he took on as well. Now, these basic biographical details don't fully allow us to understand the kind of caste oppression that Ambedkar fought against, or to recognize why he so persistently wanted the anti-colonial struggle in India to also be a fight against casteism. And to understand this sort of more nuanced and hidden pieces of caste in India, I turn to his own biography. As I mentioned, he was very prolific in terms of all the roles he occupied, and he also had, he wrote many speeches, gave speeches, he's written sort of a mountain, a library worth of work. And nestled within all these archives and found after he passed away is a slim volume called Waiting for a Visa. And that's that here. This was something he wrote out of a sense of deep outrage, and he wanted the world to know about caste oppression. It was his own autobiography. Waiting for Visa uses personal stories through which Ambedkar hopes to break through the silence around caste oppression and alert the world to the inhumanity of the caste system, or to use his words, how oppressive it is in actuality. In the preface, he addresses the foreigner, which is very interesting. And by rhetorically speaking to the foreigner, the person who's not part of Indian society, he is sort of challenging this very simple binary of India versus the colonizer. He wants to educate and inform his foreign reader that being Hindu or Indian is a complicated category, fractured with fault lines that grant privilege or deny basic human rights depending on caste positionalities. So I want to turn to a couple of stories from his autobiography. In the first story in the collection of Waiting for a Visa, we meet the 9-year-old Ambedkar. He is embarked on a train journey with his older brother and some cousins in eager and excited anticipation of meeting his father. It is probably the year 1900, the turn of the 20th century. They're dressed in silks, happily drinking lemonade, and the child Ambedkar arrives with his brothers at a railway station, expecting their father to pick them up. Due to an unfortunate miscommunication, their father is not there to receive them. The station master, who misrecognizes the young boys for being upper caste, is full of sympathy initially. And Ambedkar says, "We were well-dressed children. From our dress or talk, no one could make out that we were children of the quote-unquote untouchables." Indeed, the station master was quite sure we were Brahmin children and was extremely touched at the plight in which he found us. As is usual among the Hindus, the station master asked us who we were. When the young Ambedkar blurts out that they are from the caste of the Mahars, the friendly and helpful station master is transformed, and to use Ambedkar's own words here, he can be seen to be overpowered by a strange feeling of repulsion. The boys are immediately abandoned. It's nighttime, and no cart driver is willing to ferry them to their father's home, which is several hours away. And the story goes on to detail the fear, the hunger, the thirst, the insults, the aggressions experienced by the young child Ambedkar and his brothers. In this brief but terrifying childhood episode, Ambedkar writes how he is shocked into recognizing the gross injustices of the caste system in a visceral and humiliating manner. Sort of the first time he became fully aware of it. His journey had started out with the optimistic joy of a child embarking on a holiday and ended with a harsh reminder that he lacked legitimacy, is barred entry, and is an outsider in his own world. And he would later write that the hierarchical organization of the caste system is responsible for producing a social psychology with a scale of hatred and descending scale of contempt. Now, the second story in Waiting for the Visa starts with Ambedkar recounting his stay in the United States, where he came as a young man to pursue his doctorate. This was 1913. And for a few brief years at Columbia, the consciousness of being untouchable was, in Ambedkar's own word, completely wiped out. His choice to start his second biographical sketch of how he was able to temporarily forget his positionality as Dalit is very deliberate. He wants to alert the reader to the arbitrariness and inhumanity of the caste system, which treats him as an outsider at home. In contrast, he feels relatively welcomed in America. The United States that he encountered was New York City and Columbia University under the guidance of progressive professors like John Dewey and Edward Seligman. And one of his biographers writes, in New York, he was able to live and dine with other students, both Indian and American, and he could live on friendly terms with them. And the contrast of Ambedkar's American educational system with his ones in India are very stark. As a child in India, he had to sit separately from other students. He was isolated. He was ostracized. And for the young Ambedkar in his early 20s, the freedom that he experienced at Columbia must have been deeply liberating. But this was also the profoundly racist United States of Jim Crow laws, an America that Du Bois would say was of brutal, dyspeptic blundering and coarse, cruel wit. An anti-Black America, where being Black, Du Bois would say, was to have a double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Now, Du Bois certainly left an impression on Ambedkar, and we know later on that they would correspond and compare notes about racism and casteism and express solidarity with each other's cause. The original letters can be found in many places, and I believe the original is at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Ambedkar's stay in the West was brief, and he had to return to take up a government post in Western India. And here we have his second personal story of casteism. His educational qualifications and the fact that he had a position in the Accountant General's office, again, could not shield him from caste oppression. He tries to find a place to stay because his permanent residence is not ready. And just as when he was a 9-year-old boy at the railway station with no one to ferry him and his relatives to safety, he cannot find any place to take him in. And here we see how he is doubly colonized, because this was India during colonial rule. On one hand, as an Indian, he was barred from the English-only boarding houses where no Indians were allowed. On the other hand, the Hindu hotels and boarding houses would not take him in because of his caste status. He finally finds a very substandard and overpriced temporary lodging, only to be threatened by physical violence the next day. Being evicted, dispossessed, rendered homeless, and with no options, Ambedkar confronts his outsider status as an untouchable once again. And he would later on write in Annihilation of Caste, there cannot be a more degrading system of social organization than the caste system. It is a system that deadens, paralyzes, and cripples the people. The subsequent chapters of Waiting for a Visa include similar stories of being excluded, threatened, abused, and not just for himself, but some stories from people he knows. Ambedkar his increasing realization that despite his status and educational, as an appointee of the government, despite his educational achievements, he is not protected from the psychological and physical violence of casteism. So with his law education, he takes on court cases of caste discrimination. He becomes a political figure pushing for the end of caste oppression in India. By the 1930s, the Indian National Congress, under the leadership of Gandhi, was gaining traction to overthrow British colonialism in India. And Ambedkar pushed for the Indian Congress to recognize how caste-oppressed groups were doubly colonized, and that Congress needed to address social reform with the same force that they were fighting for political reform. And in 1931, he has a historic and heated public exchange with Mahatma Gandhi in their first encounter. And he declares, Gandhiji, I have no homeland. How can I call this land my own homeland when this religion, and this religion my own, when we are treated worse than cats and dogs, where we cannot even get water to drink? And in this heated exchange, Gandhi emphasizes unity and loyalty and homogeneity for India, and that they need to work together as the united front. While Ambedkar wants to talk about diversity and unequal power distribution and human rights. And he finally, in frustration, he says, we believe in self-help and self-respect. We are not prepared to have faith in great leaders and Mahatmas. Let me be brutally frank about it. History tells us that Mahatmas, like fleeting phantoms, raise dust, but raise no level. As you can see, he is very forthright and he takes on this very much revered figure. Now, Ambedkar wanted Gandhi and the Congress, as I said, to fight caste oppression with the same vigor that they were fighting colonialism. And it soon sort of came to a head in 1936 when Ambedkar was disinvited from giving a speech that was considered too radical. This speech, nevertheless, he published, and it resulted in a book called Annihilation of Caste, which by many scholars and social justice is considered a must read. One of his biographers writes, it was logic and fire, pinching and pungent, piercing and fiery, provocative and explosive. Reading it now with a 21st century lens, you can see how progressive and far-thinking he was when he called for justice, human rights, and equity. With righteous outrage, he addresses his audience of caste Hindus by saying that they are not fit for political power if they are not willing to annihilate the caste system, and to destroy the caste system, they have to be brave enough to dismantle Hinduism itself as a religion. He would later write, it is foolish to take solace in the fact that because the Congress is fighting for the freedom of India, it is therefore fighting for the freedom of the people of India and of the lowest of the low. The question whether the Congress is fighting for freedom has very little importance as compared to the question of whose freedom is the Congress fighting. In his speech, he imagines a free and decolonized Indian state that would not be content with throwing the yoke of the British Raj, or British colonialism. Ambedkar's vision of Dalit freedom was about interrogating the systems of oppression within Indian society while simultaneously fighting against colonial rule. Ambedkar would continue to work to end British rule and form a new and free Indian state. But what he would do is he would renounce Hinduism as his religion. In 1956, in a town of Nagpur, close to where I grew up, Babasaheb Ambedkar publicly rejected Hinduism, and he took Buddhist Diksha in a grand formal ceremony that was attended by a massive crowd of over 300,000 people. And at that ceremony, he gave a rousing speech where he reiterated a statement that he was making for quite a while. Though I am born a Hindu, I will not die a Hindu. Ambedkar's revival of Hinduism in India is very historically very significant and is referred to as Navayana or Neo-Hinduism. And what he was trying to do is he was reinterpreting Buddhism as a practice of collective emancipation for modern times. This past summer, I spent a lot of time in archives and museums related to Ambedkar's life and work, and came across a display of Ambedkar's personal Buddha figure. And this is a Buddha with his eyes open, which is a very unusual way of representing the Buddha. For Ambedkar, Buddha is awake and not sleeping. He is awake to the injustice in the world and not disconnected from it. India achieved independence from the British in 1947, and Ambedkar was the chief architect of its extensive constitution. Practices of untouchability were abolished, and progressive affirmative action measures were put into place to address the historical inequity with regard to education and economic access. Today, members of historically oppressed caste groups have achieved much success and economic power in India. Yet, social and cultural practices that discriminate and exclude continue, and horrific acts of caste violence occur in different parts of India all the time. In other words, progress has been made, but there is a long way still to go to combat physical and psychologically violent casteist practices. And so for my final point, I want to turn to our present sort of time and place. Does casteism occur here in the United States? Consider this. In 2020, the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing sued the tech giant Cisco and two of its employees for discrimination against a Dalit Indian engineer, and the case is ongoing. In April 2022, this year, a prominent Dalit activist, Tenmuri Soundarajan, was scheduled to give a talk at Google on caste as part of their ongoing DEI efforts. Her talk was cancelled after a group of Google employees put pressure on upper management, saying that talking about caste would be divisive. This led Tanuja Gupta, who's also of Indian origin, a leader of such DEI efforts in Google, to resign and write a scathing letter that was published in the Washington Post this past summer that detailed the hidden truths of caste discrimination in Google. The tech industry in the United States employs a large number of South Asians, and patterns of caste discrimination practices, from using slurs to social exclusions, have traveled with some migrants and get enacted here in the United States. Since recently, there's been a lot of silence around such discrimination, since caste is not a protected category in the United States as it is in India, and it has been hard to address. But on a brighter note, we also have many South Asian anti-caste activists here in the United States and advocacy groups who are pushing to change state laws to include caste discrimination. One of the most well-known, you can see on the screen, is a really notable effort by Tenmuri Soundarajan. She's the founder and executive director of something called Equality Labs. It's a nonprofit that advocates for Dalits and Dalit justice, and I really encourage you to, if you want to learn more, to go to that site. For the South Asian community, we have on one hand to confront the anti-South Asian hate and racism that keeps increasing here in the United States, while also uncovering the hidden truth of caste discrimination within our own community. Like Ambedkar, we have to think about the multiple ways that privilege and power intersect. And only by confronting the long shadows of hate can we emerge into a more brighter, equitable, and just space. And so I would like to end my talk with the words that Ambedkar himself used a lot towards the end of his life. He would greet people using what is considered the last words of the Buddha, which is Apo Dipo Bhava. And it's hard to translate, but loosely translated is light the lamp within you. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions on this. Thank you. I can't hear you, Elaine.
That is okay. I am now unmuted. Well, thank you so much for that, Anjali. So we'll wait a few minutes for folks to post some questions in the Q&A. But here comes a question right now. We'll start with our first question. So this is from Provost Everett. Hello, thanks for joining us. She says, thank you so much to CoLab for keeping this great series going, of course. She enjoyed the talk. She says, I'm curious about how Ambedkar is remembered in India today, and how and whether his writing and life are an inspiration for ongoing social movements in India.
Thank you so much for that question. So yes, he is... It's complicated. It depends on who's doing the remembering. So on one hand, he is very venerated, very remembered. You'll find statues of Ambedkar everywhere, and like Gandhi, you have streets named after him, and we learn about him in history. But he's mostly remembered sort of more officially in the sort of formal educational system and kind of in sort of the mainstream as being the architect of the Indian Constitution and for pushing for abolishing untouchability practices and caste-based practices. But his book, Annihilation of Caste, is not something that is mandatory reading. A lot of people haven't actually read, this is a pretty strong work here. So people sort of know him as an image, but his work and his writings, that's something whether you're either part of, groups that are doing that, it is something you'd be familiar with. On the other hand, we are seeing, I think, there's been a very strong Dalit activist movement in India as well, inspired very much from Ambedkar. And so that's why I say it depends on who you're talking to. Even from where I talked about how he converted to Buddhism, right? So along with him, hundreds of thousands of members of Dalit community members converted to Buddhism. It was quite remarkable. And so a lot of Dalit communities keep alive the stories of Ambedkar. He's an inspirational figure. He's much revered, his writings. So when I talk to, your positionality does determine a little bit of how much you might be aware of the actual details of what he said and how much you might know. But there is a lot of awareness, but it depends.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Sue Bosco. She asks, is the lack of knowledge about the caste system in U.S. companies contributing to continued discrimination within these companies among Indian employees? And she thanks you for revealing this important person to us.
Yeah, so according to Tenmuri, the Equality Labs, they actually did a huge report with collecting data, a huge survey asking people, particularly in some of these in these areas that employ a lot of Indians, on their experiences. And it showed some significant numbers in terms of caste discrimination that people do experience. So that's part of why there's been this push to have these conversations. Now in California, I believe it's the Cal State system has just recently adopted caste as part of don't discriminate, race, gender as included caste. So it is. And there are, I don't want to give a sort of monolithic view of this. And you have a lot of South Asian Indians who also pushed back and who want to see a kind of efforts towards sort of social sort of justice discourses and awareness being applied, and who push against caste. But definitely it is something that is there. And I think one of the things we are in a moment where there's some unsilencing and unhiding of this. So making things more come to light, because up till now it was not something that people were comfortable even saying. So if somebody from a Dalit community was experiencing it, they would, just not talk about it. There was a lot of silence. And I think we're really at that moment, because of a lot of this work being done, is to kind of bring things to light.
Right, thank you. The next question is, why is Ambedkar not well known outside of India? What did he do to get rid of the caste discrimination in India after India's independence? So I think maybe about the process of getting that embedded into the constitution.
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, I think that's the dominance of the Gandhi imagery. When I came, and here's the thing, it's also funny because when I came to India, to the United States as a grad student in 1991, I would be asked to give a talk on Gandhi. Everything was Gandhi. There was such a, as I said, he is sort of, and I do not mean, it's not meant to demean Gandhi's contribution in any way. I think he has made lots of contributions, and both are complicated figures actually. But there is been a lot of attention paid. I think he is. and then we have the whole sort of narrative of Martin Luther King being inspired by Gandhi and sort of the nonviolence movements and that kind of idea. Actually, Martin Luther King was also influenced by Ambedkar. There, in fact, he visits India. He goes to, he meets with Dalit communities. There are lots of stories which we don't somehow hear about. We only hear about the Gandhi and Ambedkar connection. Why? I think it's a lot to do with power and who controls the discourse and the narrative, so that's part of it. And of course, we never had a movie on Ambedkar. Gandhi had the 1980 the Oscar-winning movie, sort of was broadcast. Exhibited around the world, and I think it got again a lot of visibility to the Gandhi figure, and he's sort of an easier, more romanticized figure that we can all sort of get behind. But I think there was another question. Was there another part to that question I'm missing? Oh yeah, what Ambedkar did. So he was a lawyer, and so was Gandhi. Actually, was also a lawyer. But he really worked on the Constitution. He did lots of things. He would take case by case. So a lot of his later work, and I'm still working through so much of his writing, his work. He would take on a lot of cases, and he did a lot of advocacies, formed political, sort of parallel political parties along with Indian National Congress to push for Dalit rights. But then he was the one who, was considered the chief architect of the Indian Constitution, and the Indian Constitution enshrined in it are really pretty progressive sort of policies and progressive sort of ideas that for the end. First of all, it of course abolishes untouchability. I mean, it doesn't mean that this doesn't happen, right? It's like racism. Just because something is enshrined in legal documents doesn't mean that's not happening, but it was, it was abolished. There are what's known as the reservation system. So it's not just affirmative action, but what he put into place was a quota system. So in all government jobs and government and in universities that are public universities, it's required to have seats reserved for members of historically oppressed groups. So and that is controversial. I mean, a lot there's in India, that's something that's still debated, and people feel, in fact, right now there's some debates around it saying it should not really be to do with income based and not so much caste anymore, etc. And I think Jason would love to. Yeah. So I just co-authored. So I'm interested. I'm not a historian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm interested in the rhetoric of Ambedkar and the way he kind of frames his ideas, and how he kind of the rhetorical strategies he uses in his sort of persuasive appeals, and also the sort of the story, the narrative around social justice and how he kind of talks about it. So I co-authored a piece with my co-author Sunil Bhatia, which was a special issue in Journal of Personality on using psychobiography, looking at people who are really social change agents. So that is, I think it's already on the website, but it will, I think, formally gets published early next year. And so we were looking into his own writings, particularly the Waiting for the Visa was our focus, which was this little sort of handwritten document that was later published, where how he talks about his own personal kind of stories and some of the ways that he is really talking about being doubly colonized. So yeah, I want to still do more work on that.
And I'm not sure, I don't think everyone can see that question, but the question was about how the research and especially the work in archives are informing Anjali's project and about what the outcome of the project would be. So, okay, excellent, thank you. So we have another question from Annie Winfield. She says, to what extent does the government in India recognize and or protect against the continued casteism in India? Are there laws similar to hate crime laws here? And there's a two-parter, so maybe I'll get to this. I'll let you do that one, and we'll talk about the second part in a second.
Yes, and as I said, the Constitution has abolished untouchability, and there are, you cannot discriminate. Caste is a protected category. So the irony is, in Google, they are in Cisco, for instance, caste is not a protected category. So if you complain about it, and that's part of the issue there, complain about it, you to HR, there's no bucket, there's no sort of category to work on. Whereas the branches in India, when you have all the tech giants there doing so much of their work there, it is a protected category. So an employee there could bring a caste discrimination suit there, right? Which they weren't able to do in the same company here. And that's something the tech companies are trying to grapple with also, which is interesting. So yes, there definitely is, but in theory, in practice, we have there's corruption, there's power, there's fear, there's so many kind of ways where these cases don't necessarily always have good outcomes, or so there are some successful cases, not so successful. But there has been a rising sort of people's power and movements, and Stinpa talking about this. There was well, I can go on, but yes, it is, but it's complicated. I mean, think about similar to how we talk about race here. Yeah.
And then the second part of the question is about your mention of Du Bois and John Dewey, and Anne is asking if you could talk a little bit more about Ambedkar's relationship with them, especially during the era of eugenics. And did Ambedkar address that or write about that?
Yeah, so I don't know enough, because there's actually, interestingly, not enough written about it. And it's been, that's part of what the scholarship has said, that we need to look in more, because it's in bits and pieces. You have this letter between Du Bois and Ambedkar, and they're sort of trying to compare notes, and, how the sort of racism and casteism are, how they're similar and different. In fact, as I said, there's so much. So in fact, I was just recently kind of passing through some of his understanding. He makes a distinction between racism and casteism, in the sense that he recognizes some of the eugenic pieces in racism, and the sort of the whole biological, pseudoscience, justification given. And he says casteism is different. It's not in the same kind of way. That's the different justifications being used. And so he kind of draws some distinctions. So it's not that he's aware of these things happening and he's thinking about it, but of course his focus is caste here. So he's not, I haven't come across him actually, there is something, Annihilation of Caste, but it's not so easy to sort of give you a direct answer of what did he think. But he was very influenced by Dewey's pragmatism and his sort of approach. He was and ideas about agency and sort of self-respect and education and all those kinds of things. But he refers to them, but he's sort of working from all those ideas, but along with Buddhism as well.
Thank you. All right. Our next question is from Teal Rothschild. And she says, despite the clear oppression in the caste system, it seems that you're also saying that there is some social mobility present through misunderstood and minimized Ambedkar's ability to become prominent, for example. So what are your thoughts on U.S. depiction of caste as fully static with no social mobility?
Thank you. Yeah, Teal, exactly. And was also my worry a little bit when I talk about caste, because I was trying to give a historical sort of understanding. This is how it was. And it continues. There's no question about it, but it is, as Teal is saying, it's not static. So in India, people from caste, and I wouldn't say formally because I think there's still caste oppression, have made significant in every area, whether it's professionals, in heads of corporate India, to politicians. We've got some very, very well-known, very, very vocal political figures who come from Dalit groups. So there's no question that there is a lot of progress made and a lot of agency being expressed. And part of this agency is also expressed in through both sort of exercising and achieving this power and progress, but also to push against the existing oppression. So yes, and that is, if I started saying that sometimes India is seen only as through Gandhi, and I should actually say that sometimes, especially when I first came to the United States, I felt the only two things that people knew about India was caste and Gandhi, right? The two things. And so I do, it is something that I sort of don't want to sort of give a flattened picture of caste that's happening right now in India. It's more complicated. But the fact that it's traveled here and kind of emerges in complicated ways here is also tells you how it's this very insidious system that continues, that we need to continue to be aware of. So yes, it does. We have to be careful about flattening it. And also Gandhi, I think another way to think about it is he was against caste oppression, but interestingly, he was not against the caste system, which, and there's some debate around that, but if you read his writings, that's clear. He idealizes the Indian village, for instance. He idealizes certain sort of indigenous forms of social organization. And so he just wants it to kind of just get rid of the bad parts of it, but keep the system.
Interesting. Well, I have a question for you, if I may. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about psychobiography as a method, and how you're using that, because I know you're pulling from his personal writings. He doesn't, and his religious attitudes and perspectives, and I think it's really interesting that he goes from, he disavows Hinduism, but rather than becoming secular, embraces another faith with a very different worldview, I suppose, in terms of how human beings it has its hierarchy, right? Buddhism does as well. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about psychobiography and how that plays into this particular case.
So I think that's 2-3 pieces in your question. We'll try to sort of unpack that. So psychobiography, and I'm a novice at psychobiography, so I worked with someone who is a psychologist who's a little bit, more better with the method. But it's an approach where you're kind of bringing together, like writing sort of a biography of someone, usually a well-known person, but really trying to look at some of the sort of looking at their life history and looking at some of the sort of psychological, like the motivations or what's known as sort of episodes that kind of can explain a little bit on why they kind of did what they did, and especially since they are usually people who have left a mark on society. So it's trying to kind of do that. Now it's an interesting area because historically it had its, Freud was the used psychobiography, and then you had and it was very criticized, rightfully so, for oversimplifying and drawing too much on certain biographical elements. Now, interestingly, the psychologist Erik Erikson, who's a famous psychologist, wrote a psychobiography of Gandhi, which is always cited. So I didn't bring that here. So that was part of what we were like. That it's interesting that and it's always cited in the literature as as the sort of an exemplar. And when I read it, it was a little hard for me to read it because there are some real Orientalist tropes in that psychobiography. And part of what we were doing is to sort of do a counter narrative, to do a psychobiography. And it was an article, not a book, so there's only so much you can do when it's part of a special issue. But using this sort of psychobiographical approach of telling the story of social change from a very sort of personal psychological profile of the person, right? And looking at their sort of most personal writings. So it was a little bit to also push back against this, even in psychobiography, Gandhi's psychobiography is touted as a very important one. And so that's that part. And I think the second piece that is, we're talking about the whole, that he turns to Buddhism, right? And that I think is very interesting for me. So he wrote he could have adopted socialism or Marxism, because we have a very strong socialist party at that time. Was the Indian socialists were also very active, and he doesn't work with them, because he sees them also as, he sees that they're looking so much at class and not caste. And too much through the economic lens, and they're not, and they are, and them. And he was talking about positionality actually a lot without saying it, right? So he said that a lot of the people who were leading the Indian socialist, who were leaders in the Indian socialist movement, were themselves upper caste, and while they might have personally disavowed it, they were not, fully able to understand what it means to have a Dalit, sort of be a Dalit being, Dalit consciousness. So he pushes back. He writes now, but he does, he doesn't just come to Buddhism. So he's a very prolific writer. So he writes this piece of Buddha and Marx, where he compares Marx's writing and Buddha's writing, and then he says, here's why I think Buddha's work is much, much more meaningful to me. And he kept saying psychological freedom. So he was talking more, and that was again why we used him for our psychobiography, because he actually talks. He's like writing really like Frantz Fanon, for instance. That the psychological pieces of oppression, and he wants the movement. He wants the Indian nationals who are pushing against colonialism, the Indian socialists who are also talking to look at the psychological pieces, which he didn't think they were doing enough, because he was saying what it means to be treated in that way, or being considered a lesser human being. So he compares Marx, he compares Buddhism, and then the other piece why he turns finally to Buddhism is he makes it very clear that, because people sometimes think, and he's been accused of being an apologist for that, he was sort of colluding with the British because he was so pushing against the Indian National Congress, and he wants to make it very clear that, and he says, I know you call me the snake in the garden, I'm not, and I'll take that, but he always hits back to the British. He said the British didn't make they were not friendly to the caste oppressed groups. They were just using us, and if they really were, we would have been in a better position. We haven't been in a better position. And so he says, and so he also wants to look for a sort of a system, an alternative for the Dalit groups, sort of his people, if you will, that is indigenous, that is from India. And so he always says that it's there in our own culture. We do not have to take. So he's also very aware of pushing back against sort of the westernization as well. So he turns to Buddhism, and he's that. But he's written Buddha and Marx, which people, it's got holes in it, but he takes that on.
Sounds fascinating. I'd love to read it. Well, thank you so much. We don't have any more open questions, and we've gotten to the end of our time together, our scheduled time together. So I'd just like to thank all of our attendees for joining us and for your good questions. And of course, to thank Dr. Ram for sharing her expertise and her project with us, and really showing us it's, really the relevance in terms of our own country and our own and lived experiences here for many of our colleagues and neighbors is also really important as well. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay, let's see. What's that recording?
Are we?
I should.